Hi everyone and welcome back to Neuropsychology. So this is going to be the last video of this chapter and we are going to talk about hemispheric disconnection. We're going to talk about callosal commisurotomy, colossal genesis, and what happens to our sensory or our motor system when we have no connection between the two hemispheres. Okay, so let's start off with hemispheric disconnection. So each hemisphere has its own sensations, perceptions, thoughts, and memories. But since they always communicate to one another, these processes are basically merged and there is a lot of interplay between the two hemispheres. So the hemispheres may become completely separated under three conditions. Okay, so first, in humans, interhemispheric fibers are sometimes cut as a therapy for epilepsy. So they do this so seizures are only contained in one hemisphere. When they, for example, cut the corpus callosum to do this, there will be an enhanced conduction in the other commissures, so in the anterior and posterior commissure. Second, people can also be born with a congenitally reduced or a absent corpus callosum, which we call colossal agenesis. So we'll talk about this a little bit more in the next slide. And third, in animals, disconnections are performed to trace functional systems, kind of to model human symptoms and to answer questions about interhemispheric development. So this is often done in the research setting. Okay, so colossal genesis is the absence or having a congenitally reduced interhemispheric connection. So if you look at the image to the right, this is a beautiful, very clear structural image of a young brain without a corpus callosum. So you can clearly see where the pink arrow is, that there's no connection from the left to the right. So colossal agenesis is actually very common. So the incidence rate is about 5 per every 1,000 adults and 2 to 3 per about 100 children. So it's pretty more common than I thought. And if someone is born without a corpus callosum, there will most likely be enhanced information exchange in the other commissures to make up for the loss of interhemispheric communication. So this is again the AC and the PC, anterior commissure and the posterior commissure. So patients with callosal agenesis often have significant neuropsychological deficits, such as impairment in intelligence, visual spatial reasoning, memory, and motor movements. Okay, so Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga, they are two scientists that have extensively studied the effects of hemispheric disconnection and the behaviors that are related to both sensory and motor systems. So we're going to talk about these findings one by one in more detail. So let's start off with olfaction, then we're going to talk about vision, somatosensation, audition, and we're going to close the chapter off with movement. So of all of our senses, only the olfactory connections are not crossed. So input from the left nostril goes straight back to the left hemisphere, and input from the right nostril goes directly to the right hemisphere, so it stays ipsilateral. Fibers traveling through the anterior commissure join the olfactory regions in each hemisphere, so the information can be shared through the anterior commissure, which is one of the three commissures. So a patient who has a severed anterior commissure actually cannot name odors presented to the right nostril because the speaking left hemisphere is disconnected from this information. So the right hemisphere has the information, but no control of speech. So if you look at the image here, if the left nostril is kind of blocked off, and if you smell an orange slice or an orange candy with only the right nostril, information will go in the right hemisphere, and you'll know that you smell an orange. However, if you want to say that you smell the orange, the information has to go to the left language hemisphere, speech zone. And then you can say, hey, I smelled an orange. If the corpus callosum is cut, if the anterior commissure is cut, which exchanges the olfaction information, the information from your right nostril will go into your right hemisphere. It cannot cross over because the anterior commissure is cut, so you will still perceive that you smell an orange. However, that information cannot flow to the language or the speech zone, and you will not be able to say that you smelled an orange. So the olfaction function is still intact, and the person can still use the left hand to pick up at objects, such as the orange, that corresponds to this odor that they smelled. However, it just doesn't have connection with the speech zone that is necessary because the right hemisphere contains the olfactory information, but does not contain the speech information or instructions. So if you request a person to use the right hand to pick an object that represents the smell, the patient could not do this because if for the right hand you need your left hemisphere, so the information from your right nostril will go into your right hemisphere, it has to cross over to the left hemisphere for your right hand to be moved. And since it's cut, the information will not go through, so you won't be able to use your right hand to pick out the object, but you will be able to use your left hand. So the patient appears intact using one hand, and the patient kind of appears anosmic, aka lacking sense of smell, with the other. Okay, so we talked a lot about vision, and we all know by now that vision is crossed, so it's a little bit more complex. So, if information is flashed to one visual field, it normally travels selectively to the contralateral hemisphere. So if you can recall, information from the left visual field goes to the right hemisphere, and information from the right visual field goes to the left hemisphere. So after commisurotomy, so whenever the commissures are cut, this information is no longer shared. So we're not going to go into very deep detail, but patients with a disconnection between the two hemispheres will have severe impairments in vision. Okay, let's move on to the somatosensory system. And just like the visual system, the somatosensory is mainly crossed, and sensations of touch in the left hand will travel to the right hemisphere, and sensations of touch and pain, etc., to the right hand will travel to the left hemisphere. So if you place an object in the left hand, and it will be able to be named because the tactile information projects to the right hemisphere, and then it crosses to the left where your speech zone is, and then you can say, hey, I'm feeling this object. Okay, so again, object placed in the left hand, that information will go to the right hemisphere, then the information is crossed to the speech zone, and you will be able to say, hey, I feel that I'm holding this in my left hand. If the two hemispheres are disconnected, the somatosensory function of the left and right parts of the body become independent. So, for example, if some object is placed in the left hand of a blindfolded callosal patient who is then asked to choose the presented object from an array of objects, the left hand can pick out the object, but the right hand cannot. This is because the information between the hemispheres is not shared. So if you feel it with your left hand, that information goes to the right hemisphere, and it will not be able to cross over to give information to the left hemisphere and then again to your right hand. So if you feel something with your left hand, the information will only go to the right hemisphere. It will not cross over when someone has no connections between the two hemispheres. And if an object is placed into the right hand, the patient can name it, but cannot do so if the object is placed in the left hand. So why do you think this is true? So if you hold an object in the right hand, to what hemisphere does this information travel? Right hand goes to the left hemisphere. Where is your speech zone located? In your left hemisphere. So if you hold something in your right hand, it goes to the left hemisphere, you can say what you're holding. But if you're holding something in the left hand, it goes to the right hemisphere, and it cannot cross over because all the commissures are cut, so you will not be able to say what you are holding. Okay, this is the last slide of this chapter, and we are briefly going to dive into audition and movement and what happens when the hemispheres are disconnected. So the auditory system is way more complex because it has both crossed and uncrossed connections. So although the left hemisphere appears to receive most of its input from the right ear, it also receives input from the left ear. Therefore, if you play something or words into the left ear, it can travel directly to the left hemisphere, but it can also go directly to the right hemisphere and then through the corpus callosum to the left hemisphere. So you have these two kind of pathways that work together. So this bilateral anatomical arrangement appears to reduce the effects of disconnection. Of course, there will still be impairments, but it will reduce the effects. However, there was actually a very, very surprising effect that has been demonstrated. So in a dichotic listening task, input from the left ear is totally suppressed. So what they found was that a patient reported hearing only words that were played in the right ear, and they don't report hearing anything in the left ear. So this is surprising because words played to the left ear, even when they have a disconnection of the two hemispheres, you would expect that this information would also have some direct access to the left hemisphere. However, somehow this direct access does not appear to exist when the hemispheres are disconnected. Okay, moving on to movement. This is the last one of this chapter. And our motor system is also largely crossed, and it crosses in the brainstem. So we might predict that hemispheric disconnection will induce motor difficulties. So often this happens initially, but the brain kind of learns to rewire the motor system and information processes somewhat. And it also kind of depends on when the two hemispheres are disconnected. So if you're born with it, or if you're younger when it happens, your brain can kind of rewire this information processing. So what is interesting is that often patients that have disconnected hemispheres will have impairments when they have to use their arms cooperatively. So whenever their arms need to work together. So normally one hand informs the other what it is doing by giving feedback through the corpus callosum. But this is not possible with a hemispheric disconnection. An intermanual conflict appears in complete split brain patients where the two hands will have their own instructions. So for example, in one case, a patient would repeatedly pick up a newspaper with one hand, and then the other hand will kind of take the newspaper out of his hand and just put it right back down. Okay, so this was the last slide of this chapter. And I will see you guys back soon for the next chapter.